Government ministers, captains of industries and other stakeholders will meet in Johannesburg tomorrow to try to establish a timeline for a real recovery in Zimbabwe. Joining us now is Diane Geddes, who's the Southern African correspondent at The Economist, which is the organization essentially that's hosting this conference. Diana, thank you very much for coming through. Looking at the future of Zimbabwe under the auspices of The Economist, what are you expecting from this conference?
For people to understand a bit better what the future looks like, if we can manage to do that. Everything's so much in flux at the moment that I think it's going to be tricky to say. Obviously things have improved. Today is the anniversary of the setting up of the power sharing government. It's exactly 2 years. And so we'll be looking at that to see what difference it has made and what the future looks like, particularly from an investor's point of view.
The future of Zimbabwe, because we're coming from a torrid past, governance issues, hyperinflation, poverty, almost 90% unemployment, and today we're talking growth at about 5% and a government that's quite bullish about the way forward. Is that a realistic outlook?
For the moment, yes. Tendai Biti, the finance minister, who is one of the Movement for Democratic Change ministers, so what used to be the opposition, he originally forecast 7.7% growth this year. He's had to scale that back. He's talking about 5.4. The latest scenario from independent people is more like 4.5, falling next year, and even in 2012, 0. Before picking up again. So it's not a good outlook. The debt, foreign debt, is massive, about $6 billion, which makes it very difficult for Zimbabwe to access credit. It is using at the moment the American dollar as its currency, so it can't print money to get out of the problem. Its exports are not good because its industry has completely collapsed. So it's not bringing in foreign currency that way either. It's just applied for a $3 billion rand loan from the South African government. It's recently, I'm not at all sure the South African government's going to want to give it to it. It's recently got some money also from the African Import Bank. So there are some people out there that are willing to say, well, okay, you can have a bit, but it's not nearly enough. Another interesting thing was the Kimberley process that's there to monitor so-called blood diamonds or conflict diamonds. Initially suspended all sales because human rights groups were saying that in the Marangi diamond fields, which we don't know how big they are yet, but potentially huge, absolutely massive. Their dispute over ownership over that. But it was suspended because the army had been in there, been killing people, and then in July, Kimberley said, well, okay, we'll give you the go-ahead. So those diamonds are now being sold. There's a big stockpile of diamonds.
You talk about the fact that, you know, there's limited credit going into Zimbabwe, there are liquidity issues because it's a dollarized economy. And I think what many investors are concerned about is the status of the central bank, because effectively it's been relegated because of this dollarization to just being a regulator. And if investors are coming in using commercial channels for bringing money into the country, they want a central bank that has credibility. What are the authorities saying about that?
Well, one of the very few bits of legislation to be passed in the last year even, Parliament almost never sits. It sits and then it gets up the next day and goes off and does something else while the MPs are raking in their money. But one of the few bits of legislation to be passed is indeed a bill to reform the central bank. Tendai Biti announced the other day that staff were to be cut by 85%, that the bank was going to be limited to its core responsibilities of a normal central bank, so monitoring the money supply and things like that. But as you say, so long as it hasn't got a currency of its own, it doesn't have very big powers. Now, there's an idea that's being talked about that possibly Zimbabwe would join at some future date, possibly as early as next year, the common Southern African currency area, which South Africa as the heavyweight in. So it could finally adopt the rand, but that's somewhere in the future.
Just moving forward as well, investors are also concerned about their property rights and the rule of law in Zimbabwe. Perennial issues raised again about the indigenization laws and whether or not, we're going to see these sporadic changes in the regulatory environment, in the statutory framework in Zimbabwe. Again, what are the authorities saying about addressing these concerns?
Well, at the moment, the indigenization law is on the books. It requires 51% ownership of foreign-owned companies, or indeed non-indigenous, and by that we understand non-black. So they could be Zimbabwean citizens, but if they're white, they would also come under the terms of this law. 51% of foreign or white-owned companies to be originally ceded to indigenous Zimbabweans. Now, there was such a fuss over this word cede because it sounded as if it was going to be forced to be handed over without any compensation, that the government has agreed to amend that, and it's now spoken about as a business transaction, which still leaves it totally opaque, but nevertheless that definite undertone or even overtone of not getting any compensation has been removed for the moment. But just on that, I think that any investor that wants to go in there big time is not going to have problems. We've seen it before. We've seen it with big companies that have, in the farming area, that have been in there, and Mugabe has left them do their job because he knows they're doing it excellently and he wants the money, the taxes.
And we hear the discrepancies, okay? Growth in Zimbabwe is going to happen, but probably not at the ambitious levels we're seeing. The Zimbabwean Stock Exchange is one of the better performing African bourses, but investors are prepared to bring in money via portfolio flows, but not FDI because of some of these legal concerns.
Sure, I think that's quite natural because whilst there's uncertainty around legislation and things like indigenization, as you mentioned, is it's unlikely that people are going to go lock, stock and barrel into it. You mentioned the dollar issue, and whilst certainly that has its restrictions, it can be seen as a good thing in some ways in attracting investment because people know that they don't have to worry about investments being eroded by inflation. So, and that was one of the big problems that they had prior to that. I think the biggest challenge that Zimbabwe has at the moment is recapitalization. Is obviously that all stopped over the last decade, and I think the growth that you're talking about, that although a sharp recovery was seen initially and sort of tailoring off in the future, will be directly impacted by things like power supply, transport infrastructure, etc. Education, which has traditionally been a stronghold of theirs, is something that also into the future needs to be considered.
And Diana, very briefly, I mean, we know that SADC is leading the mediation into Zimbabwe, and hence the Zimbabwean government coming to regional powers for credit facility, and people say it's your responsibility to fix the problem in Zimbabwe. But at the same time, President Mugabe now making overtures to the West, wanting a relationship. Can SADC's positive attitude to Zimbabwe change the perceptions that Western donors and essentially the European Union and America and Britain have had towards Zimbabwe?
Absolutely not. They think that SADC is a complete cipher, that it is completely useless. It says it's going to do something, it never does. We've had a coup in Madagascar 18 months ago. They were supposed to be doing something about that. The coup leader, they haven't. The coup leader is still in power. They said that they were going to do something about Zimbabwe. They absolutely haven't. They had a meeting again last month. They said that Zimbabwe, the three political leaders of the three main parties in power, had 30 days to sort out what originally they said a whole year ago that they were supposed to solve by the beginning of December. Well, the 30 days were passed yesterday. Nothing's been resolved. It's exactly the same. We have a stalemate at the moment in Zimbabwe, which is dangerous. The only way that we can see out of it is by free and fair elections, but that is an even bigger question mark. How do you get free and fair elections without the kind of violence that we saw in the last elections in 2008, almost 100% of it by ZANU, when you've already, with the constitutional reform process, got appalling intimidation, abductions, torture, arrests. The situation is very bad in Zimbabwe.